The music softened into a hum, the kind you only hear when your pulse is louder than the room. I stood in the dress I'd dreamed of since I was 12, lace falling like a promise bouquet trembling in my hands. For one fragile moment, I believed in the fairy tale. And then Jason leaned into the microphone. Before we exchanged vows, he said, smiling wide, "Everyone deserves a little honesty about my beautiful bride." The air shifted. My laugh caught in my throat. He continued, voice dripping with mockery. "Claire looks stunning, doesn't she?" Hard to believe considering the midnight binges and crash diets it took to squeeze into that dress. A ripple of laughter broke across the crowd. My mother clutched her pearls. My best friend Rachel pressed her lips shut. My father's jaw clenched, but no one spoke. Heat seared my face. My chest tightened. Was this real? On my wedding day? Jason leaned close, his whisper colder than the spotlight. "Smile for the camera. They need to see who you really are." The room dissolved into uneasy laughter, each chuckle cutting deeper. My knees trembled, my bouquet quivered, but my feet stayed nailed to the floor. And then, I saw her. Emma, the photographer. She had her camera raised, but instead of snapping another stage shot, she lowered it slowly. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time all day, someone really looked at me. Her gaze wasn't pitying or judgmental. It was knowing, quiet, steady. She mouthed something I couldn't hear over the pulse in my ears. And later, when the chaos had settled into a blur, she would lean close and whisper, "I saw everything." In that frozen moment, with the laughter still echoing in the hall, I understood something I hadn't wanted to believe until now. This wasn't a joke. This was who Jason truly was. And everyone had just watched him strip away the illusion I'd built around us. I didn't know it yet, but Emma would become the single thread that pulled me out of the tangled mess of my life. But right then, I just stood there in my perfect dress, feeling like the biggest fool in the room, and no one moved to save me. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 28 years old, a graphic designer from Denver. And for most of my life, I believed in happily ever afters. I believed in love stories that started with nervous first dates and ended with quiet mornings in sunlit kitchens, two people growing old together with soft smiles and intertwined hands. I grew up in a modest, loving family. My parents weren't perfect, but they tried their best. My mom worked at a local library. My dad ran a small repair shop. They taught me to be kind, to forgive quickly, and to see the good in people even when it wasn't easy. But they didn't exactly teach me how to stand up for myself. If someone hurt me, I learned to rationalize it. "They probably didn't mean it," Mom would say. "It's better to let things go than to make a scene." I carried that lesson into adulthood like it was stitched into my skin. I met Jason on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was leaving a client meeting downtown, juggling my laptop bag and a cup of coffee, when I slipped on the slick sidewalk. He caught me before I hit the ground, steadying me with an effortless grip and an easy smile. "Careful there," he said, handing me my coffee, which somehow hadn't spilled. He was handsome in the way movie stars are: sharp suit, strong jaw. That kind of confident charm that makes you feel seen in a way that's almost dizzying. He told me he worked in real estate, managing high-end properties. He made a joke about being my hero, and I laughed. I didn't usually talk to strangers, but something about him felt disarming. He asked me for coffee right there in the drizzle. I said yes. The early days with Jason felt like a dream. He showed up with flowers just because. He planned elaborate dates at rooftop restaurants with candlelight and soft jazz. He made me playlists and sent good morning texts that made me blush. For the first time, I felt like I was the center of someone's universe. My friends would tease me when I told them stories about him. "Claire, you found your Prince Charming," they said. And I believed it. But looking back, I see the little cracks that were already there, hidden under the gloss of romance. Jason liked to tease me, and sometimes the jokes cut deeper than I admitted. He'd say things like, "Oh, Claire, you're adorable," when you try to sound serious after I shared an opinion. Or, "You're lucky you're cute, otherwise you'd be in trouble for being late again." I'd laugh along because it felt easier than confronting him. He started suggesting I wear certain dresses to events. "That one's a bit too plain," he'd say. "This one makes you look stunning." It sounded like care at first, like he wanted me to shine, but over time it felt like control. He made small comments about my career, too. I loved being a graphic designer. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it was creative and fulfilling. Jason, though, would smirk and say, "It's nice you get to do something fun." My work's a bit more intense. Real responsibility, you know. It was always framed like a compliment, but it made me feel small. When I'd tell my friends, they'd raise their eyebrows. "Claire, are you sure that's okay?" But I always defended him. "He's just stressed. He's under a lot of pressure with work. He really loves me." Jason had a way of making everything feel like it was part of a bigger plan. He'd introduce me to his colleagues as the future Mrs. Wright, and they'd all laugh and tell me how lucky I was. Everyone thought Jason was a golden boy, handsome, successful, generous. He volunteered for charity galas, he picked up the check at dinners, he always said the right thing in public. His image was flawless, and I felt like I was lucky just to be standing next to him. I believed in marriage as something sacred. It wasn't just an event to me. It was a lifelong commitment. I thought you chose someone, and you stayed even when it got hard. I wanted to see the best in Jason, because I was sure that's what love meant, choosing someone's best self and holding on to it, even if their worst slipped out sometimes. When he proposed, it was perfect, just like the beginning had been. He took me to a vineyard in Napa Valley, arranged for a private dinner under twinkling fairy lights. He got down on one knee with a diamond ring that made the waitstaff gasp. "Claire Bennett," he said, voice steady and warm. "Will you make me the happiest man alive?" I cried. I said yes, and for a little while the fairy tale sparkled again. Looking back, I can see how much I wanted it all to be real. I wanted so badly to believe that I'd found the man who would protect me, cherish me, lift me up. I brushed aside the uneasy feelings because they didn't fit the story I was telling myself. I didn't realize then that Jason's love was conditional, that it came with strings I couldn't see yet. At the time, all I knew was that I was engaged to a man everyone adored, and I was determined to make it work. After all, isn't that what you're supposed to do? Believe in the person you chose. Believe that love is enough. I had no idea just how wrong I was. The wedding planning phase was supposed to be exciting, full of Pinterest boards and cake tastings, and the kind of laughter that only comes from dreaming together about a shared future. At least that's what I imagined. But as soon as we started planning, Jason's demeanor shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. At first it was subtle. He took control of the guest list without asking. I came home one night with a list of people I wanted to invite, old college friends, a few coworkers who'd been there for me during tough times. But he skimmed the paper and handed it back with a shrug. "Half these people I've never even heard of. Let's keep it small. More intimate." I tried to explain how important it was to have my support system there, but he waved me off. "Claire, trust me. I know what I'm doing. You're overcomplicating it." When I pushed back gently, he leaned in and kissed my forehead, that patient smile he used when he wanted me to feel like a child. "You're being overly sensitive, babe. I'm just trying to make this easier for you." He made decisions without me about the menu, the music, even the flowers. When I asked why he hadn't included me, he'd say, "I thought you didn't want the stress. I'm taking care of you." And somehow I found myself nodding even as my stomach tightened with unease. It wasn't just the planning. He started making little jokes in front of his friends, painting me as the stereotypical bridezilla. We were at a dinner party when his best man asked how things were going. Jason laughed and clinked his glass. "Oh, you know Claire, she wants everything to be perfect." He exaggerated the word, making me sound ridiculous. Everyone laughed, even my bridesmaid Anna, who looked a little uncomfortable. I laughed too, because what else could I do? But later, when I told him it hurt my feelings, he rolled his eyes. "Babe, it was a joke. Don't take everything so seriously." I started noticing things I couldn't ignore, like the way he flirted lightly with Anna when he thought I wasn't looking. At first, it was harmless little compliments on her hair, on her laugh. But then I caught the way his gaze lingered just a second too long. When I mentioned it, he smirked. "Oh, come on. Anna's practically like a sister to me. Don't get jealous over nothing." His tone made me feel foolish for even bringing it up. The closer we got to the wedding, the more critical he became. I'd show him my dress fittings, excited, hoping for that spark of pride in his eyes. But instead, he'd glance at me and say, "It's nice. But maybe you should tone up a little before the big day, you know? For the photos. You want to look your best." It stung more than I admitted. I started waking up early to jog skipping dessert, obsessing over every detail in the mirror. I told myself it was just nerves that everyone feels this pressure before a wedding. But in quiet moments, my inner voice whispered, "Is this really love? Or am I just making excuses for someone who keeps chipping away at me?" I pushed that voice down. It was easier to believe this was just pre-wedding stress, that Jason was overwhelmed, and didn't mean any of it. After all, weddings are stressful for everyone, right? That's what my mom said when I confided in her over the phone. "Sweetheart, it's just jitters. You're marrying a wonderful man. Don't overthink it." But there were tiny moments of clarity, flickers of light in the fog. At one of my dress fittings, when I was feeling especially insecure, the photographer Emma was there to scout locations and lighting. She's this calm, grounded woman with warm brown eyes and an effortless kindness about her. She looked at me while I was fidgeting in the mirror and said softly, "You have such a natural glow. You don't need to change a thing. You look like yourself." I remember blinking at her, startled. Like myself. When was the last time someone said that to me without an edge of criticism or expectation? I smiled, awkward and small, and she smiled back knowingly. It was a fleeting moment, but it stayed with me. Meanwhile, Jason kept tightening his grip on the narrative. He insisted on writing our vows together, so they would sound polished. He vetoed my choice of music for the processional because it was too sentimental. He even told my maid of honor what kind of speech she should give. It was all wrapped in the language of helping, of making things perfect, but I felt myself shrinking under it. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, my mind looping through all the moments I'd brushed aside, the teasing, the decisions made without me, the dismissive tone, the lingering glances at Anna, the way he always made me feel like I was one step behind, like I was lucky he was choosing me at all. Still, I told myself, he's the man I'm going to marry. People aren't perfect. You just have to accept the flaws. Love is about compromise. I repeated those lines in my head like a prayer, convincing myself that everything would feel better once we walked down the aisle. But that whisper inside me wouldn't go away entirely. "Is this really love?" it asked quietly. "Or am I just afraid of what it means to admit it isn't?" I didn't know it then, but that question would answer itself in the most painful public way imaginable. The day began like something out of a dream. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of the small chapel painting, soft, colorful patterns on the white aisle runner. Guests murmured in gentle tones, the air thick with the perfume of roses and peonies. I stood at the back with my father holding my bouquet so tightly my knuckles ached, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a fragile flicker of hope. Maybe today would be different. Maybe today would remind me of why I said yes. When the music swelled, I walked slowly toward the altar, my veil trailing behind me like a whisper of possibility. Jason stood waiting, looking devastatingly handsome in his tailored suit, his smile bright and confident. For just a moment, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, the charming, attentive Jason, who made me laugh on our first date, who promised me we'd build a life full of adventures. As I reached the altar, his eyes locked onto mine. I swallowed the unease lingering in my chest and told myself, this is it. This is the start of forever. The ceremony flowed beautifully. The officiant spoke warmly. Our families looked on with teary eyes. My bridesmaids dabbed at their cheeks with tissues. Jason squeezed my hand during the vows, and my heart fluttered despite everything. Maybe I had overthought it all. Maybe love really could conquer the doubts. But then came the reception. After the meal, the DJ handed Jason the microphone for his speech. He stood in the center of the room, tall and magnetic, raising his glass. First, he said, "I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate our special day." The guests cheered and clapped. He glanced at me with that familiar smirk. "And of course, I want to thank my beautiful bride, Claire. She looks better than I expected, given how much she worried about fitting into the dress." A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the crowd. My heart jolted. He kept going. You know, he continued, his tone light but sharp. When I first met Claire, I knew she was different. She wasn't like the other women I dated. She was humble. She didn't care that I was successful. Probably because, well, she didn't grow up with much herself. He chuckled, sipping his champagne. Seriously, I remember when she told me she used to share one bathroom with 3 siblings. Can you imagine? I guess she really married up today? Laughter erupted louder this time. Some people laughed nervously, others out of habit, not knowing where else to look. I froze. My cheeks burned so hot I thought I might faint. He wasn't done. But hey, I'm a generous guy, Jason added with a grin. I believe in charity. This time the laughter felt cruel. I couldn't move. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. My father's face fell, his jaw tightening in quiet fury. My maid of honor, Anna, sat stiffly, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. Some guests looked away, pretending not to notice. Others whispered behind their hands. Jason glanced at me, grinning like this was all perfectly normal. What? It's just a joke, he said, shrugging theatrically. You all know I love her. She knows I love her. But in that moment, staring at him under the golden reception lights, I realized it wasn't just a joke. It never was. This wasn't nervous humor. This wasn't playful teasing. This was a calculated, deliberate humiliation, his way of reminding me and everyone else in that room that he was in control, that he could strip me bare in front of the people I loved and still have them laughing along with him. Inside, something cracked. This is who he really is. I thought, my breath coming shallow and fast. And I let it get this far. I scanned the room, desperate for an anchor. My mother sat frozen, her eyes darting between me and Jason. My father's hands were white-knuckled on the table. And then I saw Emma, the photographer. She was standing quietly by the edge of the dance floor, her camera hanging at her side. She hadn't taken a single shot since Jason started speaking. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes told me she'd seen it. She'd seen all of it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she lowered her camera and looked at me with a mix of sorrow and resolve. In that split second, amidst the laughter and clinking glasses, I felt her silent acknowledgement. I saw everything. I felt my hands tremble, the room tilting slightly around me. The laughter blurred into a dull roar, the kind you hear underwater. My heart pounded so loudly, I could barely hear anything else. I wanted to scream, to run, to vanish, but I just stood there, trapped in the moment like a porcelain doll, my smile cracking at the edges. Jason raised his glass one more time. To my beautiful wife, he announced. The guests clapped and cheered. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear, and whispered, "Just for me." Well, everyone deserves to know who they're really dealing with, right? And in that whisper, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. This was never love. It was control. And I knew in that instant that this day was not the beginning of forever. It was the beginning of the end. The room didn't return to normal after Jason's so-called joke. Not really. The atmosphere shifted imperceptibly at first, like the way a room feels colder after someone cracks a window in winter. Guests began to murmur softly among themselves, exchanging quick, uneasy glances before averting their eyes. A few laughed louder artificially, as if their forced chuckles could smooth over the awkwardness, erase the cruelty of what had just been said. I stood there stiff and hollow, the laughter echoing in my ears like distant thunder. My face burned so hot, I thought my makeup would melt away. Jason had already moved on, lifting his champagne glass and chatting with his groomsmen as if nothing had happened. His casual ease, his ability to act like nothing was wrong, only made the humiliation sink deeper. Anna. My maid of honor slipped quietly to my side. Her fingers brushed mine for a fleeting second, and she whispered, "Claire, don't ruin today. Just get through it. We can talk later." Her words were meant to soothe, I think, but they landed like a weight on my chest. Don't ruin today. As if the ruining hadn't already happened. As if I was the one who would make it worse by reacting. The DJ played the next song, and the guests moved back into the rhythm of celebration, eager to forget the tension, eager to pretend it was just harmless humor. Jason kept smiling, kept holding court in the center of the room. He looked untouchable, like the charming, successful man everyone wanted to believe he was. I sat down at the edge of the room, my dress pooling around me like a cage. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. I couldn't run out, not without making a scene, not without confirming in everyone's eyes that I was too sensitive, exactly what Jason always accused me of being. The reception went on. The music grew louder, the drinks flowed more freely, and people relaxed back into the party. But Jason didn't stop. Later, during the cake cutting, he leaned over me with that same smirk and said just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "Careful, sweetheart. Don't take too big a bite. You've got to fit back into that dress for the honeymoon." There was laughter again. Awkward, stilted, but laughter all the same. I froze with the knife in my hand, staring at the cake like it was the only solid thing in the room. I felt my insides twist. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about power. Jason was showing me and everyone else that he could do whatever he wanted, say whatever he wanted, and no one would stop him. After the cake cutting, I tried to find my mother. She was seated at a table near the back, with a few of my relatives sipping wine. I crouched beside her chair, my hands shaking. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. I can't do this. He humiliated me. Twice." "Did you hear what he said?" She looked at me, her eyes flickering with something, pity maybe, or discomfort. Then she smiled, that tight, polite smile she always used when she wanted to avoid making a scene. "Claire," she said softly, "maybe you're just tired. It's been a long day." He didn't mean it like that. He was just joking. You know how men can be when they're nervous in front of a crowd. I stared at her, waiting for her to say more, waiting for her to take my hand and tell me she saw me, that she understood. But she didn't. She just smoothed the edge of her dress and said, "Try to enjoy the evening, sweetheart. Everyone's here for you. Everyone's here for me." And yet not a single person would defend me. I felt the crushing weight of it settle into my chest, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just Jason. It was the silence of people who looked away, the silence of friends who whispered, "Just get through it," the silence of family who excused it as nerves or jokes. I stood there in the middle of my own wedding reception, surrounded by people I thought loved me, and I had never felt more utterly alone in my life. Jason called me over for the first dance. He held out his hand like a gentleman, and I took it, because what else could I do? The music swelled, and we moved across the dance floor while everyone watched. His smile was wide and charming. Mine was hollow. As he spun me, he leaned close enough that only I could hear and said, "Smile, Claire. They're all watching. Don't embarrass yourself." I swallowed back the lump in my throat and plastered on the smile he demanded. Around the edges of the dance floor, I caught glimpses of people I had known for years. My college friends, my cousins, my co-workers. Their faces blurred together. Some looked concerned, but said nothing. Others kept chatting and drinking like nothing was wrong. A few even clapped along to the music, their eyes glazed with the need to keep the evening light untainted by the ugly truth right in front of them. This was complicity. The loneliness was unbearable. I thought back to the years I spent dreaming of this day, imagining it would be the happiest of my life. I thought of the promises I made to myself as a little girl, that I'd only marry someone who cherished me. And yet, here I was, dancing in a white dress with a man who had made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt before, while the people who were supposed to protect me stayed silent. The only person who didn't look away was Emma, the photographer. She stood in the corner, camera hanging loosely by her side, watching me with a steady gaze. She didn't raise her lens to capture the first dance. She just watched. And in her eyes, I saw something that no one else dared show me recognition. She saw me. She saw what they all refused to see. And in that gaze, there was a flicker of hope I couldn't yet name. The reception had wound down to a dull hum, the last few guests lingering over half-empty glasses of champagne. The music had faded, replaced by the low murmur of cleanup in the hall. I was finally alone in the bridal suite, the quiet pressing in on me like a heavy blanket. My veil was tossed carelessly across a chair, my makeup smeared from holding back tears that refused to stop. I stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror, red-rimmed eyes, trembling lips, a bride who looked nothing like the girl who had dreamed of this day. I didn't even hear the door open at first. It was a soft knock followed by a voice that was calm, but steady. Claire. I turned and saw Emma the photographer standing in the doorway. She wasn't holding her camera now. She had set it aside, slung casually over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. I stammered, brushing at my cheeks in a futile attempt to erase the evidence. I'm sorry, I didn't realize anyone was still here. She stepped inside and gently closed the door behind her. For a moment, she just stood there studying me. There was no pity in her eyes, only a quiet, resolute kind of understanding. Claire, she said softly, you don't deserve this. I blinked at her, unsure if I'd heard her right. She walked closer, reaching into her bag. I've been documenting the whole day, she continued. And I want you to see what I saw. From a small tablet, she pulled up a series of unedited photos. One by one, she handed them to me, swiping slowly. At first, they looked like the typical wedding snapshots, Jason smiling in his tuxedo guests, laughing the elegant decorations. But then she zoomed in. There it was. Jason's face at the altar, caught in a fleeting sneer just before his joke, his eyes glinting with something cruel. Another photo of the guests, mid-laughter. Their faces twisted with discomfort, some looking away, others frozen in half-smiles. A shot of me, my mouth slightly open, my eyes wide, and stunned the exact moment my heart cracked under the weight of public humiliation. I swallowed hard, scrolling through the images. Then she handed me her earbuds. Listen, she said quietly. I wasn't supposed to overhear this, but my mic picked it up. It was Jason's voice, clear as day, recorded from before the ceremony as he talked to his groomsmen. Watch how I put her in her place today, he said, his tone smug, amused. She's been acting like a princess through this whole thing. She needs a reality check. It'll be funny, you'll see. My stomach twisted. My knees actually buckled, and I sank onto the edge of the vanity chair. I wanted to vomit, to scream, to disappear. Emma crouched in front of me, meeting my tear-filled gaze with calm steadiness. You're not crazy, Claire. This wasn't an accident. He wanted to hurt you. And he made sure to do it when you were most vulnerable. I pressed a trembling hand over my mouth, trying to keep the sob from escaping. The devastation of it all threatened to crush me. But underneath the grief and the humiliation, there was a flicker of something else, relief. Relief that someone had seen it, that I wasn't invisible, that I wasn't imagining it. I thought, my voice cracked, I thought maybe I was overreacting, that it was just me. Emma shook her head firmly. No, it's not just you, and you're not alone. I saw it, I heard it, and I believe you. I stared at her, unsure what to say. My entire life had been taught to keep things quiet, to endure, to smooth over the cracks. And here was this near stranger, a woman who had been hired to take pretty pictures, handing me the truth I was too scared to admit to myself. She reached out and gently touched my hand. I can't tell you what to do next. That's your choice. But you don't have to live like this. You don't have to start your life with him knowing this is who he really is. I felt the words settle into me like a stone sinking into still water. You don't have to live like this. Emma hesitated, then added quietly, if you decide to walk away, I'll back you up. I'll give you these photos, this audio. I'll tell anyone who asks exactly what I saw. I swallowed hard, blinking back tears. My throat ached with all the things I wanted to say but couldn't. In that moment, in the quiet of the bridal suite, I realized something profound. The most powerful ally isn't always the person you've known your whole life. Sometimes it's the one who steps forward when everyone else steps back. I looked at Emma, and for the first time that day, I didn't feel completely alone. The morning after the wedding, the Denver sky was a pale gray, muted and heavy, mirroring the weight sitting in my chest. I hadn't slept. My wedding dress lay in a heap on the floor of my apartment, the once beautiful lace, now just fabric that reminded me of shame. My phone buzzed with messages, some from guests, thanking us for the beautiful day, some from relatives asking if I was okay. I ignored them all. I knew what I had to do. I texted Jason. "We need to talk. Meet me at the cafe on 5th Street at noon." He responded almost instantly. "Sure, babe. I knew you'd want to clear the air. I'll see you there. Clear the air." As if what he'd done was a mild misunderstanding. When I walked into the cafe, he was already seated, lounging back like he owned the place, coffee in hand. He flashed me that signature grin, the one that used to make me feel special, but now made my skin crawl. "Hey," he said casually, standing to kiss my cheek. I stepped back and his smirk faltered for a second. I sat down across from him, my back straight, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest. I placed my tablet on the table and met his eyes. "Jason, I'm going to get straight to the point." He tilted his head, still smug. "Listen, if this is about yesterday, you really need to lighten up." Everyone was laughing. It was just a harmless joke. Without a word, I tapped the screen. The photos Emma had given me glowed in the soft cafe light. The sneer on his face at the altar, the guests' uncomfortable expressions, the exact moment my heart shattered, captured in crystal clarity. His confident smirk faltered slightly. "What is this evidence?" I said calmly. My voice didn't shake. I swiped to the next file, the audio recording. Jason's voice, cocky and cruel, filled the tiny space between us. "Watch how I put her in her place today." His face paled, and for the first time I saw something that wasn't smugness or arrogance. I saw fear. "This wasn't a mistake," I said evenly. "You planned it. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone I love." He scoffed, recovering quickly, though I could see the edges of his bravado cracking. "Claire, you're overreacting. It was just a joke. Everyone laughed because it was funny. You're being dramatic. You always are." "No." I leaned in slightly, my voice low but firm. "I'm not being dramatic. I'm done." His brow furrowed. "Done. What do you mean I'm annulling this marriage?" I said simply. "As of today, we're finished. There is no us. There never really was. Just your ego and my hope that you were better than this." Jason blinked, stunned. Then he laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You can't be serious. You'd ruin both of our reputations over something so small." I met his gaze without flinching. "You already ruined mine yesterday. Now it's time for the truth to come out." Before he could respond, I slid my phone onto the table. "I've already sent the photos and audio to my family and friends. By tonight, everyone who was at that wedding will know exactly what kind of man you are." His face flushed red, his hand clenching around his coffee cup. "Claire, think about what you're doing." "No, Jason." I stood my chair, scraping against the floor. "For once, you think about what you did." I walked out of the cafe without looking back. By the time I got home, the fallout had already begun. My phone was flooded with messages. My maid of honor texted Claire, "I'm so sorry, I should have said something. I felt sick when he made that joke, but I didn't know how to stop it." Another from a cousin, "I can't believe he said that to you." I'm ashamed I laughed. I thought I was just going along with the crowd. "I'm so sorry." Even distant relatives were reaching out. One wrote, "I had no idea he was like this. I thought he was charming. I should have trusted my gut when I saw how uncomfortable you looked." And then came the messages about Jason. Women I didn't know personally, acquaintances from his past relationships, started reaching out. He did the same thing to me. He humiliated me in front of his friends, once called it a lesson. Thank you for exposing him. I wish I had been brave enough to leave. It turned out Emma's photos and the audio recording had been shared more widely than I expected. Friends of friends, colleagues, even people from Jason's work saw it. His carefully curated golden boy image started to crumble overnight. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his groomsmen confronted him, demanding answers. His boss called him in for a discussion about conduct. The very same friends who had laughed along with his jokes at the wedding were now distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with him. For years, Jason had been a master of twisting reality, making women like me doubt ourselves, gaslight our instincts. But this time, the truth was louder than his manipulation. And I wasn't afraid anymore. I moved into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the west side of Denver. It wasn't fancy, just white walls, a tiny balcony, and the faint smell of fresh paint. But it was mine. For the first time in months, maybe years, I woke up without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing on my chest. The silence of the apartment was comforting, not suffocating. No passive-aggressive comments over breakfast, no condescending sighs, just me. The first thing I did after unpacking was book a therapy appointment. I'd always brushed off the idea before telling myself I was strong enough to handle things on my own. But after Jason, after the humiliation, after realizing how many times I'd ignored my instincts to please someone else, I knew I needed help untangling the mess in my head. Dr. Patel's office was warm and calm with soft lighting and plants in every corner. In our first session, I barely made it through the first 10 minutes before my voice cracked. I told her everything, not just the wedding, but all the small cuts that had led to that day. The jokes I laughed off, the times I'd convinced myself it wasn't that bad, the moments I'd silenced my discomfort because I thought love meant enduring. She listened without judgment. "Claire," she said gently, "you're grieving more than just a relationship. You're grieving the version of yourself who believed she was safe." Those words stayed with me. Emma stayed in my life too. She texted me a week after the cafe confrontation, "Coffee my treat." We met at a quiet little shop downtown. She came in wearing a bright yellow scarf and that same calm, steady presence she'd had on my wedding day. "You look lighter," she said, handing me a latte. "I feel raw," I admitted, "but free." She nodded. "That's how it starts." We sat there for hours sharing pieces of our lives. She told me about her past, a relationship she'd walked away from years ago, a partner who chipped away at her confidence until she felt like a ghost of herself. She never told me all the details, but she didn't need to. I could see in her eyes that she understood the quiet kind of pain. "You did more for me than you realize," I told her. "You saw me when no one else would." Emma smiled softly. "Sometimes that's all it takes, one person to say, 'I believe you.'" Little by little, I started piecing myself back together. I picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years. My easel had been shoved into the back of a closet while I was with Jason because he always teased me about my little art hobby. Now it stood proudly by the window of my new apartment, sunlight spilling across the canvas. The first painting I made wasn't perfect. It was messy, abstract, all swirling blues and sharp streaks of red, but it was mine. I started hiking again, too. I'd loved hiking before Jason, but he always complained it was boring and preferred expensive rooftop bars. One crisp Saturday morning, I drove up to Lookout Mountain alone. The air smelled like pine and freedom. I stood at the top, wind in my hair, looking out over the city, and I felt small in the best way. Small, but whole. A month later, I walked into a women's support network in the city. It was a small nonprofit tucked between two busy streets, its walls lined with handwritten notes from survivors. I signed up to volunteer, helping organize events, sharing resources, just being present for anyone who needed a safe space. On my first day, I met a woman who had just left a toxic relationship. She sat across from me, wringing her hands, her voice shaking as she said, "I feel like it's my fault. Like I should have seen it sooner." I reached across the table and gently said, "It's not your fault. I know because I've been there, and I promise you it gets better." Her eyes filled with tears. Mine did too. Weeks turned into months. Therapy helped me untangle the knots of self-blame. Volunteering reminded me I wasn't alone. Painting and hiking made me feel alive again. Slowly, my self-trust rebuilt. I stopped questioning my instincts. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped dimming myself to keep someone else comfortable. And somewhere along the way, my smile came back. Not the stiff, camera-ready smile I'd worn for Jason's world, but a real one, the kind that starts in your chest and reaches your eyes. One evening, I set up my phone to take a picture of myself in my apartment. No makeup, just a cozy sweater and messy hair. I looked at the photo afterward, and for the first time in a long time, I saw someone I recognized. Not the broken bride, not the humiliated fiancé, just Claire. Whole. I used to think the worst moment of my life was standing there in that white dress surrounded by laughter that wasn't kind, feeling the world tilt beneath me as Jason tore me down in front of everyone I loved. But with time I realized something deeper. The real tragedy wouldn't have been that single humiliating moment. The real tragedy would have been if I stayed silent. If I let the shame that wasn't even mine settle into my bones and keep me trapped in a life where my voice didn't matter. Walking away wasn't easy. It was messy. It was lonely at first. People whispered. Some said I overreacted. Others pretended nothing happened, like my pain was too inconvenient to acknowledge. But silence protects the wrong people. It always does. And the moment I chose to speak, even if it was only to myself at first, was the moment I began to heal. If you're reading this or hearing my story, and you've ever been made small in front of others, if you've ever felt that sting of betrayal when no one stepped in to defend you, hear me now. You are not invisible. Someone sees you, and you have the right to walk away, even if it feels impossible, even if you don't have all the answers yet. Walking away isn't weakness. It's choosing yourself over the lie that you have to earn someone else's love at the cost of your dignity. Months after the wedding, that wasn't Emma and I met again. We were at a small community garden on a sunny afternoon, hands dirty with soil. It was her idea. Let's plant something together. She'd said, something that will grow no matter what came before. We dug small holes in the earth, carefully placing seeds and flowers into the ground. Tulips, daisies, wildflowers that didn't need much tending but would bloom beautifully anyway. As I pressed the last bit of soil over the roots, I felt something shift inside me. This little patch of color wasn't just a garden, it was proof. Proof that endings can give way to beginnings. Proof that something fragile can still grow strong. Emma looked at me and smiled. "Funny thing about gardens," she said. "They don't care about the past. They just grow." I smiled back, feeling a quiet peace settle over me. Sometimes I still catch myself thinking about that day, the dress, the laughter, the sting of betrayal. But it no longer feels like a wound. It feels like a doorway. A doorway I had to walk through to find the life waiting for me on the other side. I didn't walk away from my wedding in shame. I walked away in freedom. And if you're standing in a place right now that feels impossible, whether it's a relationship, a job, a friendship, remember this: you can choose yourself. You can plant something new, and it will grow. Would you like me to now create a full combined narrative of all 9 sections into one seamless, emotionally powerful story, ready for a video script or blog post?